Good morning and welcome. I'm continuing the series I started last week, One Blood, One Race. These messages compile upon one another, and last week I want to take what we built there and continue on this week. And of course, this is a series in which we're looking to the answers found in Scripture to the major social issues we see today. Things such as the Black Lives Matter movement, systemic racism, white privilege, the list goes on. But what we're experiencing today, when you turn on the news, is we are reaping what has been sown over the last 100 years. That is a very clear biblical principle. You reap what you sow, and that's what we're doing now. Today I'm going to look at, last week what we looked at is the seed of Darwinism and how that has spread and infiltrated all aspects of culture. And now we're going to look at what that branched into, eugenics and the fruit of eugenics. Let me pick up where I left off last week. Systemic racism, which, by the way, I absolutely agree is real and it exists. Systemic racism, though, is not something that comes as a result of the planning of this nation, but rather it comes from man's sinful heart. It's bred into the human race, which in recent history has been fueled by the science of Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution makes some claims and they have some denials. What this teaching does is it denies that we are created in the image of God. It denies the dignity bestowed on us because we are God's creation, created in His image. It devalues our worth, for our worth has been established by Jesus Christ on the cross as He gave His life for ours. And it denies the fact that sin is the penalty of death. Darwinian evolution proclaims that death is natural. It's not the penalty for anything. It's the way of just natural progress. Whereas the scriptures say, no, sin is the penalty, or death rather is the penalty of sin. What Darwinian evolution promotes is it promotes that some people are more advanced than other people. And this is signified in the color of one's skin. The lighter somebody is, the more advanced they are. The darker somebody is, the less advanced. That's what Darwinian evolution has given us. And I believe firmly, with every ounce of conviction in me, that the Bible represents the answers to our questions and the solutions to the problems we see, not only in our own personal lives, but in society at large. And we're going to take a look at, again, how does the Bible answer what is taking place today? Romans 12:3 says this, For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, with clear thinking, with the thinking that the Scriptures provide. You don't think of yourself as better than anybody, regardless of color, and never forget that you are a sinner like the rest who have been brought into this world. King Solomon, the wisest person who ever lived, wrote this in his book Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 20. He said, indeed, there is no one on earth who is righteous, no one who does what is right and never sins. What you won't hear on the news is, you're going to hear on the news that we live in a broken world, but they're never going to trace it back to the fact that we're a fallen world, that sin is at the root of all of this. Now, Darwinian evolution birthed the science of eugenics, which further has fueled systemic racism. And this came about by Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. Francis Galton came up with this theory that some people are born superior to others. They have superior qualities like character, disposition, energy, intellect, physical power. It's that debate, nurture versus nature. He says, no, you're endowed with those, you're born with those. And then he further went on to say, these characteristics are the characteristics we find in the social elite. By that, he was meaning in the white upper class. That's what his theory was. And he said then that in order for the survival of the race to continue, we should be breeding the best with the best. That was his theory that he put out there, and this theory caught fire. By the way, eugenics is a word and that many of us have never heard or don't understand exactly what does eugenics mean. And so let me give a definition to you. Genetics is the science of improving stock or improving breed, whether human or animal. If you know anybody that's a rancher, they very carefully guard their stock, their breed, making sure to bring in new DNA. And eugenics applies that theory not just to animals, but to humans as well. It comes from a Greek word, the Greek word meaning good in birth or noble in hereditary. Galton made observations. He was in the 19th century. He made observations that he saw genius begin to decline. He thought, where are the great thinkers? And those that he could find were all in this elite white upper class. And he said this theory was that the white upper class, they're not producing or reproducing as quick as the poor people. He thought the poor people were intellectually inferior to them, and he was alarmed at the birth rates. And he says, we got a problem here, and this problem has to be addressed. And he made further observations based on what his cousin Darwin was doing. And he said this. He says, with animals, the weak are soon eliminated, but not so with humans. You've heard this phrase, survival of the fittest. That came from Darwin. Well, Galton's saying that may be true in the animal kingdom, but it's not true with humans. Why? Because humans do our utmost to check the process of elimination. How do we do that? Well, we build asylums for imbeciles. We build hospitals for the maimed and the sick. We institute poor laws, social welfare. Medical personnel are trained to save the lives of everyone to the very last moment. Vaccinations preserve millions. And he's talking about the big scare then was not coronavirus, but it was smallpox. And he says, in essence, because of intervention, the weak have been allowed to propagate. The weak are surviving, and they shouldn't, according to Darwinianism. And so eugenics was coming in to replace this. And what Galton came down to, his conclusion was this, is that compassion is not allowing humans to die off, the weak ones to die off. He blamed the problem on human compassion. Evil, that's all I can say is evil. Listen to what the scriptures say, Psalm 41:1. Blessed are those who have regard for the weak. The Lord delivers them in times of trouble. Why does God relay this? Because that is the heart of God. God is concerned about the weak. Even just examine the life of Jesus. Who is he reaching out to? The disenfranchised, the poor, the lame, the weak, the humble, the deaf, the blind, all of them. And he was bringing relief and healing to them out of what? Out of a heart of compassion. I want to read to you Matthew 25, verse 35, which happens to be our theme verse for Fridays at 5, our food ministry. By the way, the little catchphrase we have for Fridays at 5 is fighting hunger, feeding hope. And the key verse comes out of words of Jesus, Matthew 25:35. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. And that's exactly what we believe is the heart of God, that we who represent him should represent his approach to humanity as well. Verse 36 of chapter 25 goes on to say, I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. In other words, you didn't let me suffer in my weakness. And yet Galton says that would be an answer to the problems we have today. In fact, think of all the great Christian charities and compassion industries or ministries that exist. We have World Vision, just to name a few here. Samaritan's Purse, Compassion International, Catholic Charities, and the list goes on. I could not possibly take the time to mention them all, but these are great ministries there to help the underprivileged. This eugenic movement is not very well known in our history because it's not being taught. There's a great amount of ignorance in the world, and ignorance is the result of, or what fights off ignorance, rather, is education. And part of this message is not only representing what God's view is, but also to provide a certain amount of education. And this may be news to you, but the American eugenics movement was going hot and heavy in the early 20th century. Of course, it got toned down after World War II, and you'll see why. But there is a person who represents this movement. Her name is Carrie Buck. I have a picture of her here. Carrie Buck was born in 1906, and she's pictured there with her mother, Emma Buck. Their father either died or abandoned the family. History's not sure on that. But as a result, these poor white folk were homeless. They were in Virginia, and they were living on the street. And of course, that's tragic to see a mom with a toddler living on the street. And so a very well-to-do couple, a couple from this white elite class named John and Alice Dobbs, they saw this and they petitioned the courts to adopt Carrie. And they were granted permission to adopt Carrie. Carrie grew up in their household, the Dobbs' household. And when she was 17, she became pregnant. She says, her claim was that Alice Dobbs' nephew had raped her. That is how she became pregnant. And of course, this is a scandal for anybody in that social stratus in society. And so what they did is they committed her in 1924, they committed her to the Virginia Colony for Epileptics and the Feeble-Minded. That's what they did. They put her away. And that was 1924. At this exact same time, the United States was leading the world in this eugenics movement, followed right behind by Germany. It was Adolf Hitler who got many of his ideas from American research on eugenics, and we know what he did. His final solution, who he saw the Jews as inferior people, was to exterminate them. It was all birthed out of the same line of thinking, this eugenics movement. Incidentally, Theodore Roosevelt, Alexander Graham Bell, John D. Rockefeller were outspoken supporters of the eugenics movement. Eugenics at the time was taught in schools, exhibited at the World's Fairs, and preached from pulpits. The superintendent of the Virginia colony, was a eugenicist as well, and he believed that part of the solution lay in forced sterilizations. And that's what he was proposing, but he needed legal protection. In other words, he had to test his theory in court, and Carrie Buck was just the person to do that. Carrie was declared to be a mid-grade moron. And I've observed that in today's culture, we don't use that word moron very often. However, when I was in grade school, that's how we bullied one another. You moron? You know, I heard that many times. But what a moron was intellectually a little bit above idiot or imbecile, but a little bit less than normal. Now, morons were dangerous because they were smart enough to pass undetected, and if they passed undetected, they could breed with intellectual superiors, namely the white upper class. And Carrie was viewed to be a walking womb. Because she had already been pregnant, she was viewed as being sexually promiscuous, and she was a pot of genetic poison who might spoil pure bloodlines. And so as the test case, she was sterilized. It went to court, went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court of the law of the land, and in a ruling of 8-1, forced sterilization based on the science of eugenics was permissible, now permissible. It was a law written into our books. The justice at the time who wrote the majority opinion was a fellow named Oliver Wendell Holmes. You may have heard of him. And this is what he said based on this case. He said, "It is better for the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. Where's the dignity? Where's the value? Where's the worth? 32 states then passed eugenic sterilization laws, and some 60 to 70,000 people were sterilized. This landmark case, Buck versus Bell, which, by the way, is still on the books today, was brought up and used by the Germans as part of their defense in the Nuremberg trials. Between the years of 2006 and 2010, 148 female prisoners here in the state of California have been sterilized. Eugenics, the evil of eugenics is this, is that eugenics is the philosophical foundation of the abortion industry. Not only was there Francis Galton, but there was a disciple of his named Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was a 19th century professor, and he made these same observations. He says, wow, with all these poor people breeding so fast, there is a population time bomb ready to happen, and humanity is going to go downhill as a result. We've got to come up with a solution. He condemned charities as he believed they exasperated the problem. And for Western civilization to survive, he theorized the physically unfit, the materially poor, the racial inferior, which was people of color, and the mentally incompetent had to be eliminated. That's what he presented. And of course, into this environment walked Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger is the founder of Planned Parenthood, and she embraced Malthusian eugenics. Margaret Sanger, as the founder of Planned Parenthood, it wasn't always called Planned Parenthood. There was a few other names before that, but the first name she assigned to this was called the Negro Project. The goal was to restrict, some will say eliminate, the black population under the pretense of better health and family planning. It's a lie. In her early writings, she wrote this: the most serious charge that can be brought against modern benevolence is that it encourages the perpetuation of defectives, delinquents, and dependents. They are the most dangerous elements in the world community, the most devastating curse on human progress and expression. And of course, she's talking directly to people of color and to poor whites. She proposed to the U.S. government that people be given a bonus if they voluntarily got sterilized. Her first clinic was opened in Harlem called the Harlem Clinic. She observed that blacks endured extreme prejudice and discrimination contributing to their plight, and it seemed to justify restricting their numbers. Her answer to poverty and degradation lay in smaller numbers of blacks. And she shrewdly propagated this lie and got prominent black leaders at the time to support her. Very shrewd. One thing about evil, evil presents a lie as the truth. That's part of the danger in it. Listen, I want to share with you some of the things that are attributed that she has said. 7 statements that are shocking. First, we don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. She wrote that in a letter to Mr. Gamble of Procter & Gamble. Gamble was on her board of directors, and in a letter wrote this down, revealing where eugenics had taken her and what her plan was. She also said, point 2 is, I accepted an invitation to talk to the women's branch of the Ku Klux Klan. Regarding the defectives, delinquents, dependents, in referring basically to people of color, she said they are human weeds, reckless breeders, spawning human beings who should have never been born. Is this sickening or what? She says birth control is nothing more or less than weeding out the unfit. Of this class of humans, she says human beings who should have never been born at all. And then there's an interview. You can still watch. You can go to Google. I did. It's 1957. It's in black and white. It's an interview between Margaret Sanger and Mike Wallace. 30 minutes long. I watched that. Listen to what she said in that. She says, I think the greatest sin in the world is bringing children into the world that have disease from their parents. This would include the disease of color. That have no chance in the world to be a human being practically, delinquents, prisoners, all sorts of things, just marked when they're born. Then she also said, but for my view, I believe that there should be no more babies. Planned Parenthood. This is 100 years ago, but this is what it was founded on. And those are deeply embedded in that organization. Listen to what God says. God says this in Psalm 139, for you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. Here is personal experience, first person, I praise you. You knit me together in my mother's womb. In other words, I existed right from fertilization. And if you've ever looked at DNA, doesn't it look like a weave? It's just spot on. Verse 15 of Psalm 139 says, my frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. We are scientifically, true science, we are fully human from fertilization. All the DNA is there. All the genetic code is there. Nothing is added after fertilization. All the genetic information is present, and a fertilized human cell is totally human. There's no biological basis for any other explanation for when we become human. Every human is fully human from fertilization to the end of life. That is the biblical perspective. That is the biblical truth. Dr. Alveda King, who was Martin Luther King's niece, said this, the most obvious practitioner of racism in the United States today is Planned Parenthood, an organization founded by the eugenicist Margaret Sanger and recently documented as ready to accept money to eliminate blacks. That too I've Googled. And there are recordings of people phoning up various Planned Parenthood clinics and saying, I would like to pay for the abortion of a black baby. Will you accept my money? Every single one of them said, yes, we will. And we'll make sure it goes to eliminating or aborting one of those black babies. Planned Parenthood, on the other hand, has gone to great lengths to repudiate the organization's eugenic roots. They've said, no, that's lies, that's coming from the conservative right. They don't know what they're talking about. They've made all this up. Conservative blacks know the difference. They've created a march called the Say So March. It's been occurring for the last 20 years. It happens once a year in Washington, D.C., Newark, New Jersey, Philadelphia, where they come out, and it's against Planned Parenthood for being a racist organization. I do my sermon prep on Tuesday. That's when I do my hard work. And it's an exhausting day for me. I lock myself in my office, and that's what I'm doing. And last Tuesday, after I finished all this, my wife and I took a walk at the trails across from Scotts Valley High School. They're beautiful, by the way. And came home, had the dinner, and just relaxing. At 9 o'clock, I decided to turn on the TV. And I turn on the TV, and there it is, Fox News. I'm listening to Shannon Bream. And Shannon Bream is interviewing Reverend Dean Nelson, the director of the Human Coalition, and Benjamin Watson, he's a retired NFL player, who is producing a film called Divided Hearts of America. And what they were talking about was the news that came out that day, Tuesday, just Tuesday. This is hot off the press. Karen Seltzer, the chairman of the Greater New York Planned Parenthood, said this: the removal of Margaret Zanger's name from our building is both a necessary and overdue step to reckon with our legacy and acknowledge Planned Parenthood's contributions to historical reproductive harm within communities of color. She confessed it. That's a great first step. I pray that organization will cease to exist. You know, even today, 80% of all abortion clinics are within walking distance of black communities. Abortion is the number one killer of blacks in America. Every day, on average, 931 black babies are aborted. A black woman is 3.5, depending on which city they live in, 3.5 to 5 times more likely to get an abortion than a white woman. The American Life League in September of 2019 presented an abortion fact sheet, and they said the white population is 64% of America, and whites account for 35% of the abortions. Black represents 16% of the general population, but even have a higher number of abortions, 38%. Hispanic, 12% of the population, 19% of the abortions. Abortion, Planned Parenthood, their message, it's absolutely racist. Its roots are to limit the number of blacks or eliminate them and other people of color as well. When I look at this, you know what the headline news should be? Should come right out of here, and I got just the place. Romans chapter 1. Here is the answer to what is going on. Romans 1:28 says this, furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they do what ought not to be done. What's happened here in the last 150 years is, God, we're going to cut you out. God is no longer allowed into our schools, into our government, into our courthouses. God has been pushed out. Churches have become irrelevant and regulated to the immaterial. And so what happens is we see the depravity of man rising up. Verse 29, they have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, murder, strife, deceit, malice. Tell me that doesn't describe one of the protests we see on TV. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. In other words, they have no regard for authority. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy, no compassion. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but they also approve of those who practice them. I'm waiting to come home and turn on the TV and hear that on national news. It may not happen. So you and I need to be the messengers of that news. You know what really gets me? And I get worked up over this because it's evil, because it's wrong. If you go to the Black Lives Matter website and you look at that, there's a place that says donate here. If you click on that, you can see where the money goes. In fact, there's been $1 billion given to Black Lives Matter. A portion of their money, follow it, trace it, goes to Planned Parenthood. How crazy is that? How hypocritical is that? We're all for black lives. Let's kill 931 every day. I can't get behind this. Now, you create a march to protest Planned Parenthood and what they're doing to black lives there, and I'm all in. How can corporations give money to Planned Parenthood and to Black Lives Matter at the same time? How can so many individuals marching in the Black Lives Matter movement also be supporters of Planned Parenthood? How can the government fund this? It's evil, I'm telling you. It's evil. And God wants us to return to the truth and to return to Him. I want to share one last thing. Remember I talked about Francis Galton. He's Charles Darwin's cousin. Well, Galton made 2 discoveries that might have led another scientist to abandon eugenics altogether, and this movement may have never happened. First, he created a test to measure intelligence, and he administered it to his elite white upper class, and he also administered it to a lot of poor people. a statistically relevant number of people, and he was astonished to find out that the poor people did just as well as the elite people in intelligence tests. His conclusion, not that his theory was wrong, but the test, something was wrong with the test. That is called ignorant, blind science. In another experiment, he was looking at the propagation of pea plants, and he took pea plants that had high quality parental strains. And he, after doing research, realized that the offspring, some were as good as the parents of these superior strain of peas, but some were worse, and most were a little bit worse. And if that were truly applied to humanity, it would be impossible to improve race through eugenics. We've been living a lie, and it's been given to us wholesale. Our educational system breeds the new generation of racists. We have abandoned God. We've abandoned God. We need to return. Can I say this? Can I say, continue, pray for our nation? Always start with yourself. Ask God to remove the plank out of your own eye. I mean, we're all products of this culture we've been raised in. Ask God to help you be part of the solution, no longer part of the problem. Pray for our leaders. Pray for your pastors. Pray for your churches. Pray that this truth will get out there. And then also, do the research. Dig deep. I've been spending I can't even tell you how much time looking into this, reading books and watching videos. There's some things that I highly recommend. There's a movie called The 13th. It's on Netflix. And this is a documentary on the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery except for criminals. And it talked about how blacks were then criminalized so that they could be put back into forced slavery. It's eye-opening. It's history. And when you look at that, you can just see, yeah, the blacks that are out there rioting, these young blacks, they're right to be fed up. They've had enough. But they're trying to solve it out of ignorance. They don't understand the very roots of what they're trying to address. And then there's another movie I recommend called Uncle Tom Movie. A friend of mine let me watch this. You have to pay for it. It's out on DVD. But I think there's only one white person in it. They're all black people, and they're talking about racism in America. But it's from a conservative point of view. Very eye-opening. And then I'd also say, if you don't know Candace Owen, get to know her. I recommend following her. She's regularly on Prager University, PragerU. She's a 30-year-old black conservative that is just amazing. I tell you what, if she runs for president, she has got my vote. She is amazing. But educate ourselves, get involved. This is the issue of the day, and we have answers. Why? Because we have the scriptures and God has answers. Let me pray. Father, it's a sad day we're living in, and we see really what's been sown over years. We're reaping that today. God, it's time to pull up all of that junk we're reaping and resow some new seeds, some seeds of truth, God, that they might take over. I pray, God, your blessing on the truth going out. And I thank you, God, for the opportunity to reveal your heart and your insight and your wisdom on these matters. I pray this in Jesus' name.